Today we're going to be taking a look at the Spanish political system, which is beautiful and at the same time it's weirdly complex. Some people might even say it's a little sexist. My goal here is for you to understand everything that's going on in this board, so that if you watch any single piece of Spanish news, you're going to understand the players, the institutions, everything in the Spanish political system context.
Okay, but before we start, this is going to be a long video. That's why I divided it into 4 big parts. The first part is going to be talking about the executive branch of the Spanish state. The second one about the legislative branch. The third one about the judiciary branch. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about how Spain is divided territorially. Now back to the video.
Now, if you're coming from the United States, you're in luck because you're going to find this system fascinating, especially because the head of our state, it's a king. Yes, that's amazing that the head of the state is a king, but you have to understand that after the Constitution of 1978, the king doesn't hold real power. It doesn't mean that he doesn't play a role in the Spanish state, which he does, and it's a very important role. He sort of plays like a referee between the different political parties. So when there's a big issue between them, he can talk to them and somehow sort it out. And he's done that in the past. Both our current king, Philip VI, and his father, they've both done a wonderful job at that. They've also done a very good job internationally. And there have been situations in the past where the king has represented Spain in a way that the president of the government couldn't. Now, how is that possible? Say that the president of the United States doesn't want to talk to the president of Spain because they have very different political views. Well, by talking to the king, it's like saying, I can say yes to Spain without saying yes to the Spanish government. So the king does play a role. It is not like in the old days where kings were absolute monarchs. Right now, the king does play a role. It's just not the biggest political role you would know from other parts of Spanish history. Now, after the king, we have the 3 branches of government. Like in most Western countries, we have the executive, the legislative, and last but not least, the judiciary. But we also have something that's very different than other countries, and that is the Tribunal Constitucional. Although most Spanish people think it is, it's technically not part of the judiciary system. But it's somehow related, and we're going to be taking a look at it. But we're going to be starting right now with the executive branch. Now, the executive branch, as you probably know, is the government of Spain. Now, there is a difference in how the government is elected. In the United States, the people elect the president and
Let me stop right here, because what I just said is technically incorrect. In the United States, the people vote not for the president, but for their representatives in the Electoral College. And then the Electoral College is the one that votes for the president. What I was trying to say with this is that the election to president of the United States is actually different to the election to the legislative branch of the United States, either Congress or the Senate. Back to the video.
In Spain, these two are kind of linked. So in reality, Spanish people don't choose their government. They choose who represents them in the legislative elections, which are every 4 years. And every 4 years, the legislative changes, and the legislative, the Congress, is the one who appoints the president, not even the government. They appoint the president. And the president is the one who forms his Consejo de Ministros, which would be something sort of like his cabinet. But it really has a lot more importance in Spain than in other countries, okay? But this is very, very important to understand. Why? Because in the United States, when the president dies, the vice president becomes president, right? I think the most recent case is Lyndon B. Johnson and Kennedy. That would not happen in Spain, because when Congress gives someone the authority to create or to start a government, they are appointing a president, and that president is the head of the government that he's starting. If that person ceases to be president, then the whole government ceases to exist. This is very important because this is completely different to the United States. Now, does this mean that Spain doesn't have a division of powers? Well, It's a little complex to answer, but yes, we do have division of powers. Let me explain how it works. Let's say you have a cake, right? And you take a knife and you slice it in two halves. The cake, it's most definitely divided, but it's not separated, right? In the United States, they're both, the executive and the legislative are both divided and separated. In Spain, they are divided, but they're not completely separate. So the president of Spain, is he part of Congress? Yes, they sit in something that's called the blue bench, the Banco Azul, along with his Consejo de Ministros. But they're technically not part of Congress, although the president can be a congressman as well, right? So they're somehow divided, but they're not separated, which is why the president does go to Congress. Unlike in the United States, where the president has to be invited by the Speaker of the House to Congress, in Spain it's absolutely natural. The president of the government goes to Congress every single week. And he does so to the Senate, exactly the same. So the executive branch of the government, it's basically the president, who has his own Consejo de Ministros, which, by the way, changes every 2 years, more or less. Since there's a 4-year legislator, and the government, because of that, it's 4 years also, the president, in most cases in recent history, has chosen to remake his government after 2 years, which has been the case almost for every single party. Now, besides the Presidente and the Consejo de Ministros, there are two other institutions that you might hear that are not that important, but that play a role in advising the government. That is Consejo de Estado, Council of State, and Consejo Económico y Social, which advise the government in different things. Now, of the two, the most important by far is the Council of State. Council of State historically had a very, very big importance. Today, it's not that important. It's formed primarily of people who have held important positions in the Spanish state in the past, just like ex-presidents or ex-vice presidents. A lot of them are in the Council of State, and they have the role of advising the government. Sometimes the government has to ask for the Council of State opinion, but they don't have to follow it necessarily. And now most of the time it's just a procedure they have to follow, and they don't really care what the Council of State says, but it does have some sort of authority, especially among lawyers and among attorneys. The Council of State's opinion, it's quite important. Although, the government doesn't have to follow it necessarily. Now, let's talk about the legislative branch of the state. Now, as many countries, we have two separate bodies, Congress and the Senate. Just like in the United States, Congress represents the people, while the state represents the different territorial parts of Spain. But unlike in the United States, where the balance of power is very well distributed between the two, in Spain, almost 95% of the big decisions, are made in Congress. The Senate does play a role in calming things down when sometimes Congress makes a law and it's very harsh, and in the Senate, they just give it a different thought and make it better. They call it a cooling institution because it sort of cools things down when things get heated in Congress. But when you're watching the news, most likely you'll always watch Congress. Well, you could watch the Senate if the president is attending the Senate, but in most cases, it's going to be Congress. Now, Congress is comprised of between 300 and 400 people. But right now, the law states that they are 350. So in order to have the mayoría absoluta, which means that you have at least half plus one Congress, you need 176. That's the magic number. To rule Spain, you need 176 congressmen and congresswomen. Now, the Congress is also called the Cámara Baja, which a lot of people don't know, but if you hear in the news, the Cámara Baja, ironically, is also the Congress, not the Senate. The Senate, on the other hand, is called the Cámara Alta. The Senate's composition, it's a little bit weird because the way they are elected depends on the senator itself. Now, Every province, which is something we'll take a look at later, elects 4 different senators, while other senators are appointed by the comunidades autónomas. You'll understand this later when we take a look at this part, so we'll talk about this in just a while. The other 2 institutions that you might hear about in the legislative branch are the Defensor del Pueblo and the Tribunal de Cuentas. The Defensor del Pueblo is a person appointed by the legislative branch that has one role, and that big role is to make sure that the rights of the citizens are met. That's it. So he does have some power when something feels that it's unconstitutional. It can go to the Tribunal Constitucional, which is something that we'll see later in the Judiciary Branch. But if you have to remember one thing about the legislative branch, is that the Congress is the most important. This is where the big political parties fight. Now, in Spain currently there are 5 big political parties, although this might change in the future. You have the PSOE, which is Partido Socialista Obrero Español. You have Podemos, which is a recently created leftist party. You have the PP, Partido Popular. You have Vox, which is also very recently created, right-wing party. And you have Ciudadanos, which could disappear, but who knows, maybe they will survive. Those 5 parties are the main national parties. But you also have some regional parties which play a huge role when deciding the government, which are mainly the Basque and the Catalan political parties. They've had a huge importance in the past, and they have it right now in today's government. So much for the legislative branch. Let's talk a little bit about the judiciary branch. Now, the judiciary branch is a little bit weird, okay? Mainly because the Tribunal Constitucional is separated, okay? And there's another organ that you might hear a lot of in the news, which is called the Consejo General del Poder Judicial, which is sort of like the Supreme Court, but it's not the Supreme Court. So let me explain how this works. In the United States, the Supreme Court decides basically everything. Laws, cases, if something is constitutional or unconstitutional. In Spain, to decide whether something is constitutional or unconstitutional, that's the Tribunal Constitucional, which is completely separated. So the Supreme Court of Spain could ask the Tribunal Constitucional, hey, do you think this is constitutional? But they're not the only ones who can do that. Also, 50 congresswomen and congressmen could decide to go to the Tribunal Constitucional, or senators, or the government, or the Defensor del Pueblo. So there are a bunch of people along the state that have the authority to go to the Tribunal Constitucional and say, hey, I think this is unconstitutional. But it's not just them. Every single Spaniard has what is called a recurso de amparo, which means that when there's a case where you think that you're being treated unfairly because the law that's being applied to you is unconstitutional, then you have the right to go to the Tribunal Constitucional. So they do decide about cases, but only to the extent of whether it is or not constitutional. That's it. Everything else, the Supreme Court is the Tribunal Supremo. Now that I've explained this, you're probably wondering, what is the Consejo General del Poder Judicial? Now, this is something that you're going to hear in the news a lot. The Consejo General del Poder Judicial, it's sort of like the government for the judges. That's basically it. So it's comprised of 20 people plus 1, the president. Out of these 20 people, 10 are elected by Congress and 10 are elected by the Senate. And the Consejo General del Poder Judicial elects its own president, making 21 in total. Now, this has been very hot news recently because the government's trying to change both the ways that the Consejo General del Poder Judicial and the Tribunal Constitucional are chosen, which could violate essentially the division of powers in Spain. But that's going on right now, and we don't know how it's going to work out. Now, the Tribunal Constitucional is formed of 12 magistrates with a 9-year time period. Every 3 years, 1/4 of the Tribunal Constitucional is renewed. Now, 4 magistrates are chosen by Congress with a majority of 3/5. Another 4 magistrates are chosen by the Senate, again with a majority of 3/5. And 2 are elected by the Consejo General del Poder Judicial, and 2 are appointed by the government. That is how the Tribunal Constitucional is composed today. These 2 are a lot in the news because they are the ones who control most of the stuff, especially because the president of the Consejo General del Poder Judicial, which is the ones that appoint all judges in Spain, is also the president of the Tribunal Supremo, which is, just like in the United States, the Supreme Court, which is the most important court regarding cases in Spain. Now, the Tribunal Supremo is the most important by far, but there's one that would be rivals when it comes to the news, and that is the Audiencia Nacional. It's a special part of the Spanish judiciary that basically investigates very, very bad crimes. Just yesterday, we heard very bad news. There was a terrorist attack in southern Spain, and they killed one person in church, and they almost killed one of the priests. That is considered terrorism, and because it's terrorism, that's investigated by the Audiencia Nacional. So every time there's a case around corruption, around terrorism, that's basically the Audiencia Nacional. You might also hear a lot about the Fiscal General, also called by its complete name, the Fiscal General del Estado. The Fiscal General del Estado is the head of the state's attorneys. He's appointed by the government, but he doesn't necessarily have to listen to everything that the government says. Now, the government can ask him to do things, and he can reply saying yes or no. And when he does, he has to argue as of why he's saying yes or why he's saying no. And in most cases, since he's elected by the government, well, he's going to do what the government wants. But it's not necessarily true all the time. And with this, we basically finish the structure of the Spanish state. A state where the head is the king, that the people choose a legislative branch, that also chooses the government, that also has a judiciary, that has a government of the judges, which has its Supreme Court, the Audiencia Nacional to investigate the biggest crimes, and the Tribunal Constitucional, which is like the Supreme Court, but only for those cases regarding the Constitution. Now, all this has to do with the state institutions, but there are also a lot of local or regional institutions. Now, these are the state's institutions. The comunidades autónomas, there are 17 comunidades autónomas in Spain, are basically like the states in the United States. But unlike in the United States, when the states got together to create a federal government, Spain voted one constitution. And the constitution, in its 8th título, had a possibility for different regions of Spain to become comunidades autónomas. Now, today, every single region that had the possibility to become a comunidad autónoma did, except the 2 little ciudades autónomas, Ceuta y Melilla, which are a different case. But right now we have 17 comunidades autónomas, which, believe it or not, have a lot more power than the state when it comes to day-to-day life of its citizens. Now, every comunidad autónoma has its own government, its own legislative, and there's also a Tribunal Superior de Justicia, which would be sort of like the Supreme Court for that particular comunidad autónoma. But it's not the Supreme Court, right? The Tribunal Superior de Justicia, it has the Supreme Court on top of it, okay? So the comunidad autónoma could be considered in a way like a little state because they do have their government, they do have their legislative, and they do have their own courts, but it's not a state. It's not like in the United States. It's different in the way that the state was first and then the comunidades autónomas came. There is something, however, that did come before the comunidades autónomas, which are the provinces. Now, the provinces come from 1833 with Javier de Burgos, who basically divided Spain in 50 different parts, plus the two autonomous cities of Ceuta and Melilla. But right now, we still have, although there have been some changes, we still have those 50 provinces. Now that is important because the comunidades autónomas are formed of different provinces. There are comunidades autónomas like Madrid or Murcia, which have only one province, Madrid and Murcia, whereas other autonomous communities like Andalucía have a lot more. You probably heard about Málaga, Sevilla, Cádiz, Almería, Huelva, okay, Córdoba. There are a lot of provinces, okay? So when people say where they're from, most of the time they're talking about their province. They're not talking about their autonomous community, which would be a loose translation in English. And naturally, you've also have the municipios. The municipios are what you guys would call a town hall, the ayuntamiento in Spanish, there are a little over 8,000 municipios in Spain right now, and 50 provinces. The municipios can come together sometimes to form what is called a mancomunidad, which is a 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, number of municipios that come together to basically make their services a lot more efficient. And that is basically the whole structure of the territorial Spain. This sums up the Spanish political system. And you're probably wondering now, why is this sexist, as I said in the beginning? Well, there is a good reason, and that is that the Constitution, which was approved in 1978, says that the heir to the king has to be a man. Well, not has to be a man. If he doesn't have sons, then his daughters can become queens. But if he has a son, even if he's the sixth or seventh son, then he automatically becomes the new king. Now, that's unlikely to happen because the king right now has 2 daughters and nobody thinks they're going to have any more children. But if he had a son right now, that would be a huge deal because the Spanish society is very open and they definitely see that as unfair. So we do know that we have to change our constitution to make sure that the firstborn son, whoever it is going to be the heir. But as of today, first come the men. And if there are no men, then come the women. That, of course, will hopefully change. But right now, it's not a top priority as our king only has 2 daughters. His eldest daughter is called Leonor, and she is the Princesa de Asturias, who will hopefully one day be our queen. And this sums up the Spanish political system, which, as you've seen, is beautiful and complex. If you want to download this, we'll have a PDF for you down in the description, and we'll send it to you right away. Thank you very much for watching.
Señoras y señores, muchas tardes y buenas gracias.